In the grand halls of Valeria Palace, where centuries of tradition dictate every breath, and whisper holds the power to topple kingdoms, a single moment of defiance would change everything. When Princess Isabella's trusted driver suddenly veered from the familiar route home, what began as a routine evening would spiral into a dangerous game of loyalty, betrayal, and family secrets that threatened to expose the monarchy's darkest truths. Crown Prince Alexander had always protected his family from the shadows, but this time, stepping into the light might cost him everything he held dear. Some roads lead to safety, others lead to revolution, and sometimes the most dangerous journey begins with a single wrong turn that was never wrong at all. The rain drummed against the bulletproof windows of the royal limousine as Princess Isabella adjusted her emerald necklace for the third time in 10 minutes. The charity gala at the Grand Metropolitan had been another successful evening of diplomatic smiles and carefully worded speeches, but something felt different tonight. Perhaps it was the way Lord Chancellor Blackwood had avoided her eyes during their conversation about the upcoming trade negotiations, or maybe it was the strange tension she had noticed between her stepmother, Queen Consort Victoria, and her brother Crown Prince Alexander. Isabella glanced at her phone. The luminous digits showed 11:47 p.m., and they should have been back at Valeria Palace by now. The familiar landmarks of the capital city had given way to unfamiliar streets lined with modest homes and flickering streetlights. She leaned forward and tapped the partition separating her from the driver's compartment. "Marcus, I think we've taken a wrong turn," she said, her voice carrying the gentle authority that came naturally to someone born into royalty. Marcus Whitfield had been her personal driver for 3 years, a reliable man in his 50s with an impeccable record, and the kind of steady demeanor that put everyone at ease. The partition remained closed. Isabella frowned and pressed the intercom button. "Marcus, can you hear me?" Still no response. The car continued down the increasingly narrow streets, and Isabella felt the first flutter of genuine concern. She tried the door handles, but they were locked from the driver's controls, a standard security feature that suddenly felt like a trap. Meanwhile, across the city at Valeria Palace, Crown Prince Alexander stood in his private study, staring at the secure phone in his hand. The call had come in 20 minutes ago from Detective Inspector Sarah Chun of the Royal Protection Unit, and her words still echoed in his mind. "Your Highness, we've lost contact with Princess Isabella's security detail. Her vehicle deviated from the planned route approximately 30 minutes ago." Alexander ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture that would have earned him a sharp rebuke from the royal etiquette coach in his youth. At 32, he had learned to carry the weight of the crown with dignity, but tonight that weight felt crushing. Isabella wasn't just his half-sister. She was his closest confidant, the one person in the palace who saw through his carefully constructed public persona to the man beneath. "Have you contacted the palace security?" he asked Detective Chun, already knowing the answer. "Sir, there's something else you need to know. We believe Marcus Whitfield may not be acting alone. Intelligence suggests there may be a coordinated effort involving someone with access to palace protocols." The phone felt heavy in Alexander's hand. A coordinated effort meant this wasn't a random kidnapping or a simple case of a driver losing his way. This was planned, calculated, and, most terrifyingly, it involved someone they trusted. "I'm coming with you," Alexander said, already moving toward his private elevator. "Sir, protocol dictates that you remain secure while we handle the situation." "Protocol can go to hell," Alexander replied, his usual diplomatic language abandoned in the face of his sister's danger. "She's family." Back in the limousine, Isabella had managed to find her personal phone in her clutch purse. The screen showed no signal, which was impossible in the heart of the capital where cell towers provided complete coverage. Someone had installed a signal jammer, which meant this was no accident or case of a confused driver. This was deliberate. She closed her eyes and tried to remember everything from her security briefings. Stay calm. Assess the situation. Look for opportunities. Don't panic. The training sessions that had seemed like tedious protocol exercises suddenly felt like lifelines. The car slowed and turned into what appeared to be an abandoned warehouse district. Isabella could see the reflection of water in the distance, which meant they were near the old harbor area, at least 15 miles from the palace. The limousine came to a stop in front of a nondescript building with boarded windows and rust stains running down its concrete walls. Marcus finally turned around, and Isabella saw that his familiar, reassuring face had been replaced by something cold and calculating. "I'm sorry it had to be this way, Your Highness," he said, his voice carrying none of its usual warmth. But some things are bigger than personal loyalty. What do you want? Isabella asked, proud that her voice remained steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. It's not about what I want, Marcus replied, opening his door. It's about what needs to happen to save this country from itself. Isabella heard multiple car doors slamming outside, followed by footsteps approaching the limousine. Through the tinted windows, she could make out at least 4 figures, all dressed in dark clothing and moving with military precision. This wasn't a crime of opportunity or passion. This was a coup attempt disguised as a kidnapping. Her mind raced through the implications. If they had taken her, they likely had a specific reason. She was third in line to the throne, behind Alexander and her younger brother Prince Michael. But Michael was only 16 and still in boarding school in Switzerland, which made her the most accessible target for anyone wanting to put pressure on the royal family. The passenger door opened, and a man she didn't recognize extended his hand. He was approximately 40 years old, with the bearing of a former military officer and eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of her appearance. Your Highness, my name is Colonel James Hartley, formerly of the Royal Guards Regiment. I need you to come with me, and I give you my word that you will not be harmed if you cooperate. Isabella remained seated. Colonel Hartley, I assume you understand the consequences of what you're doing. Kidnapping a member of the royal family is treason, punishable by life imprisonment. Hartley's expression didn't change. Your Highness, with respect, I believe the real treason is what's been happening to this kingdom under the current regime. Sometimes drastic action is necessary to preserve what we hold dear. And what exactly do you believe you're preserving? Isabella asked, genuinely curious despite her precarious situation. The soul of Valeria, Hartley replied. Your father, God rest his soul, understood what this country needed. Strong leadership, traditional values, and independence from foreign influence. Since his death, certain elements within the palace have been steering us toward policies that will destroy everything he built. Isabella felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool night air. This wasn't just about her, or even about the immediate royal family. This was about the fundamental direction of the kingdom, and she was being used as a bargaining chip in a game much larger than she had initially realized. Meanwhile, Alexander's convoy was racing through the city streets with Detective Chun coordinating the search from the passenger seat of his armored vehicle. They had managed to trace the limousine's GPS signal to its last known location before it went dark, but that had been over an hour ago. The trail was growing cold, and every minute that passed decreased their chances of finding Isabella safely. Sir, we've received intelligence that suggests this may be connected to the restoration movement, Detective Chin reported, her voice tense. Alexander's blood ran cold. The restoration movement was a political organization that had been growing in influence over the past 2 years, calling for a return to the traditional monarchy that had existed before his father's progressive reforms. Publicly, they presented themselves as a legitimate political party advocating for constitutional changes through democratic processes. Privately, intelligence services had suspected them of more radical activities. Do we have any idea who's leading this operation? Alexander asked. We believe Colonel James Hartley may be involved. He was dismissed from the Royal Guards Regiment 18 months ago for making inflammatory statements about palace security protocols and the influence of foreign advisors on royal policy. Alexander remembered Hartley, a decorated officer who had served with distinction for over 15 years before his increasingly radical views led to his dismissal. The man had been brilliant at his job, which made him all the more dangerous as an adversary. What does he want? Alexander asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Based on our analysis of restoration movement communications, they likely want to force a change in the succession laws and foreign policy direction. Princess Isabella's position in the line of succession makes her a valuable asset for putting pressure on the crown. The convoy turned onto the highway leading toward the harbor district, following the limousine's last known trajectory. Alexander stared out at the city lights rushing past and tried not to think about all the ways this could go wrong. Isabella was smart and resourceful, but she was also alone with people who had already demonstrated they were willing to commit treason to achieve their goals. Back at the warehouse, Isabella found herself in a surprisingly well-appointed room that had clearly been prepared in advance for her arrival. There was a comfortable chair, a small table with water and sandwiches, and even a few current magazines. It was the kind of considerate treatment that suggested her captors wanted to maintain the illusion that this was a temporary inconvenience rather than a genuine kidnapping. Colonel Hartley had left her alone after explaining that they were waiting for certain political developments to unfold, but he had also made it clear that she was not free to leave. The door was locked from the outside, and she could hear guards talking quietly in the hallway. Isabella examined her surroundings more carefully. The room appeared to be a converted office space within the warehouse, with windows that had been painted black to prevent anyone from seeing in or out. However, she noticed that the paint job wasn't perfect, and thin slivers of light from the street lamps outside created barely visible lines along the window edges. She moved to the largest window and began carefully scraping at the paint with her fingernail, creating a small hole that allowed her to see outside. The view confirmed her suspicion that they were in the Old Harbor District, and she could make out the distinctive silhouette of the Meridian Bridge in the distance, which gave her a rough idea of their location. More importantly, she could see 2 guards patrolling the perimeter of the building and what appeared to be several vehicles parked in strategic positions. This wasn't an amateur operation, and Colonel Hartley had clearly drawn on his military training to organize the security arrangements. Isabella sat down in the chair and tried to think through her options. She had no way to communicate with the outside world, no weapons, and no clear avenue of escape. However, she did have something that her captors might not have fully considered: detailed knowledge of palace protocols and security procedures. If Alexander was coordinating the search for her, he would be working with Detective Chun and the Royal Protection Unit. They would have sophisticated tracking and surveillance capabilities, but they would also be constrained by the need to avoid a violent confrontation that could result in her injury or death. The key insight was that Colonel Hartley and his associates were former military personnel who understood conventional security operations, but might not fully appreciate the unconventional resources available to the royal family. Isabella smiled slightly as she remembered a conversation she had had with her father shortly before his death, when he had told her about certain special arrangements that existed to protect the royal family in extreme circumstances. She closed her eyes and tried to recall the exact details of what he had told her about the emergency protocols that could be activated in case of a direct threat to the monarchy. There was something about a code phrase that could be transmitted through certain channels to activate resources that existed outside the normal government and military command structure. The door opened, and Colonel Hartley entered with a man she recognized as Lord Chancellor Blackwood, the same person who had avoided her eyes at the charity gala earlier that evening. The pieces of the puzzle suddenly clicked into place with startling clarity. "Lord Chancellor," Isabella said, rising to her feet with all the dignity she could muster. "I should have known you were behind this." Blackwood looked uncomfortable, his usual confidence replaced by nervous energy. "Your Highness, I want you to understand that this is not personal. This is about the future of the kingdom. Kidnapping members of the royal family is an interesting way to demonstrate concern for the kingdom's future," Isabella replied coolly. "Your brother has been influenced by advisors who do not have Valeria's best interests at heart," Blackwood continued. "The trade agreements he's negotiating will make us dependent on foreign powers. The social reforms he supports will undermine the traditional values that have made this kingdom strong." Isabella studied Blackwood's face and realized that he genuinely believed what he was saying. This wasn't simple ambition or greed. This was ideological fanaticism dressed up as patriotism, which made it far more dangerous than ordinary criminal behavior. "What exactly do you want from me?" Isabella asked. Colonel Hartley stepped forward. "We want you to make a public statement explaining that you have concerns about the current direction of the monarchy and that you believe changes in leadership are necessary for the good of the country. And if I refuse, then you'll remain our guest until your brother agrees to reconsider his policies and advisors," Hartley replied. Isabella sat back down and folded her hands in her lap. "I see. So this is essentially a hostage situation disguised as a political statement. This is a necessary intervention to save the monarchy from destroying itself," Blackwood said, his voice rising slightly. Isabella looked directly at him and spoke with the authority of someone who had been trained from birth to command respect. "Lord Chancellor, you have served this kingdom for 20 years with distinction. My father trusted you, and so did I. But what you're doing here tonight will destroy everything you claim to be protecting." For a moment, Blackwood's resolve seemed to waver, but then Colonel Hartley placed a hand on his shoulder. "Your Highness, we've prepared a statement for you to review," Hartley said, extending a piece of paper. "We'll give you some time to consider your options." After they left, Isabella unfolded the paper and read the proposed statement. It was carefully worded to sound reasonable and concerned rather than treasonous. But the implications were clear. If she read this statement publicly, it would be used to justify a challenge to Alexander's authority and potentially force changes in the government that could destabilize the entire kingdom. She thought about her brother, probably organizing search teams and coordinating with security services while maintaining the diplomatic composure expected of a future king. She thought about her younger brother Michael, safe in Switzerland, but who would return to a very different world if this plot succeeded. Most of all, she thought about her father's last words to her about the responsibilities that came with royal birth. Isabella stood up and walked to the window again, peering through the small hole she had created in the paint. In the distance, she could see lights moving along the main road, and something about their pattern suggested organized activity rather than random traffic. Alexander was coming for her, just as she knew he would. She sat down at the small table and began to plan. Alexander's convoy had reached the harbor district, and the tension in the lead vehicle was palpable. Detective Chun was coordinating with multiple search teams through her encrypted radio, while Alexander stared at the tactical map displayed on the screen between them. Red dots marked the locations where Isabella's limousine had last pinged cell towers, and the search area formed an ominous circle around the abandoned warehouse district. "Sir, we've identified 3 potential locations where they could be holding Princess Isabella," Detective Chin reported. "Thermal imaging from our surveillance helicopter shows unusual heat signatures at 2 of the locations, suggesting occupied buildings in an otherwise abandoned area." Alexander studied the map more carefully. His military training, completed during his required service in the Royal Navy, had taught him to think strategically about tactical situations. What about the 3rd location? It's showing minimal heat signature, but our intelligence suggests it might be deliberately masked. Colonel Hartley would be familiar with techniques for avoiding thermal detection. "We approach all 3 simultaneously," Alexander decided. "I don't want them to have time to relocate her if we guess wrong." Detective Chin hesitated. "Sir, with respect, protocol requires that you remain at a safe distance while we conduct the rescue operation." Alexander turned to face her directly. "Detective Chun, my sister is being held by people who have already demonstrated they're willing to commit treason. Protocol doesn't apply when the monarchy itself is under attack." Before Chun could respond, her radio crackled with an urgent transmission from the command center. "Control to Chun. We've intercepted communications suggesting the kidnappers are planning to move the princess within the next 30 minutes. Repeat, they may be planning to relocate." Alexander felt his stomach tighten. If they moved Isabella to a different location, the search would have to start over, and there was no guarantee they would be able to track her again. Time was running out. "All teams converge on target locations immediately," Chin ordered into her radio. "This is now a priority 1 rescue operation." Meanwhile, Isabella had been examining every inch of her makeshift prison for the past hour. The room was more secure than she had initially realized, with the door reinforced from the outside, and the windows painted not just for privacy, but to prevent her from signaling for help. However, her detailed inspection had revealed something interesting about the building's construction. The warehouse appeared to have been converted from an older structure, and the room where she was being held had been created by installing temporary walls within a much larger space. The ceiling was a dropped ceiling with removable tiles, and she could see slight variations in the tile alignment that suggested access panels. Isabella carefully moved the chair beneath what appeared to be the loosest ceiling tile and climbed up to investigate. The tile lifted easily, revealing a dark space above the temporary ceiling. More importantly, she could feel air movement, which meant there was ventilation and possibly access to other parts of the building. She was about to investigate further when she heard voices in the hallway outside her door. Isabella quickly replaced the ceiling tile and repositioned the chair, sitting down just as the door opened. Marcus Whitfield entered, looking uncomfortable and avoiding her eyes. Behind him was a woman Isabella didn't recognize, approximately 35 years old with the crisp bearing of someone with administrative authority. "Your Highness," the woman said, "my name is Margaret Thornberry. I'm here representing certain concerned citizens who share Colonel Hartley's vision for the future of Valeria." Isabella studied Thornberry's face, noting the careful way she spoke and the expensive quality of her clothing. This wasn't another military conspirator. This was someone from the political or business establishment, which suggested the plot had broader support than she had initially realized. "Ms. Thornberry, I assume you understand that what you're participating in constitutes treason against the crown." "What I understand, Your Highness, is that sometimes extraordinary circumstances require extraordinary measures, Thornberry replied. The policies being promoted by your brother and his advisors will fundamentally alter the character of this kingdom. Isabella leaned forward slightly. What policies specifically concern you? The trade agreements with the Eastern Coalition will make us economically dependent on foreign powers, Thornberry said, her voice gaining intensity. The proposed social reforms will undermine traditional institutions that have served this kingdom for centuries. The immigration policies will change the fundamental demographics of Valeria. Isabella had heard similar arguments in Parliament and in certain newspaper editorials, but hearing them used to justify kidnapping a member of the royal family put them in a very different context. These weren't policy disagreements that could be resolved through democratic processes. These were ideological positions being imposed through criminal action. Ms. Thornberry, assuming for a moment that your concerns are legitimate, do you really believe that kidnapping me will solve these problems? We believe that your public support for reconsideration of these policies will provide the political cover necessary for more moderate voices to emerge within the government, Thornberry replied. Isabella realized that she was dealing with people who had convinced themselves that their criminal actions were actually patriotic gestures. This kind of self-justification made them potentially more dangerous than ordinary criminals because they believed their cause justified any means necessary to achieve their ends. And if I refuse to provide this public support? Marcus Whitfield finally spoke, his voice heavy with regret. Your Highness, I've served your family loyally for years, and I hope you know this brings me no pleasure. But the stakes are too high to allow personal feelings to interfere with what needs to be done. Isabella looked at Marcus with genuine sadness. She had trusted this man with her safety for 3 years, had asked about his family, had remembered his birthday, and his wife's surgery. The betrayal was personal in a way that the political motivations of the others were not. Marcus, whatever they've promised you, whatever they've convinced you to believe, this will not end well for any of us, she said quietly. Before Marcus could respond, Colonel Hartley's voice echoed through the building's intercom system. All personnel to positions. We have incoming vehicles approaching the perimeter. Isabella felt a surge of hope mixed with fear. Alexander had found her, but that also meant the situation was about to become much more dangerous. If shooting started, there was no guarantee that anyone would survive unharmed. Thornberry and Marcus quickly left the room, and Isabella heard the distinct sound of multiple locks being engaged on the other side of the door. She waited until their footsteps had faded, then immediately climbed back onto the chair and pushed up the ceiling tile. The space above the ceiling was cramped and dark, but Isabella could see light filtering through gaps in the building's structure. More importantly, she could hear voices echoing through the building's ventilation system, which meant she might be able to gather intelligence about her captor's plans. She carefully pulled herself up into the ceiling space, being mindful not to put too much weight on any single tile that might give way beneath her. The space was dusty and filled with electrical conduits and ventilation ducts, but it was also large enough for her to move through if she was careful. Isabella oriented herself toward what she thought was the front of the building and began crawling through the ceiling space. After several minutes of careful movement, she reached a position where she could see light coming through a ventilation grate. Peering down, she could see Colonel Hartley and several other men examining what appeared to be tactical maps while monitoring radio communications. Perimeter teams report at least 12 vehicles approaching from 3 different directions, one of the men reported. Professional formation, definitely law enforcement, or military. Colonel Hartley studied the map. Defensive positions according to Plan C. Remember, we're not trying to win a military engagement. We're trying to maintain leverage until our political demands are met. Sir, what if they attempt a forced entry? Hartley paused before answering. The princess remains our primary asset. As long as we control her location, they can't take action that might put her at risk. Isabella realized that her captors were counting on Alexander's concern for her safety to limit his response options. They were using her as a human shield, which meant that any rescue attempt would be extremely dangerous for everyone involved. She continued moving through the ceiling space, trying to get a better understanding of the building's layout and the positions of the guards. The warehouse was larger than she had initially realized, with multiple rooms and what appeared to be a loading dock area that could serve as either an escape route or a defensive position. As she moved, Isabella could hear radio communications from the Royal Protection Units outside. The voices were distorted by the building structure, but She could make out enough to understand that Alexander was coordinating a careful approach designed to avoid escalating the situation into violence. She reached a position above what appeared to be the building's main entrance, and could see through another ventilation grate to the area where several of Hartley's men were positioned behind makeshift barriers. They were armed with military-grade weapons and appeared to be experienced in defensive tactics. Isabella realized that she might be in a position to provide intelligence to the rescue teams if she could find a way to communicate with them. She remembered the emergency protocols her father had described, including certain coded signals that could be transmitted through unconventional means. She continued exploring the ceiling space until she found what appeared to be an access point to the building's electrical system. Isabella had received basic technical training as part of her royal education, including instruction in emergency communication systems. Working carefully to avoid electrocution, she managed to access a junction box that controlled the building's external lighting system. If she could manipulate the lights in a specific pattern, it might be possible to send a coded message to the teams outside. Isabella began systematically turning lights on, and often a sequence based on the royal emergency codes her father had taught her. The pattern was complex enough that it wouldn't be mistaken for random electrical problems, but simple enough that trained royal protection officers would recognize it as an intentional signal. Outside the building, Detective Chun was monitoring all aspects of the developing situation when one of her technical specialists approached with a puzzled expression. "Detective, we're seeing unusual activity with the building's external lighting system. The pattern appears to be intentional, but we can't determine what's causing it." Chun studied the technical readout showing the lighting pattern. As someone who had been thoroughly briefed on royal family emergency protocols, she recognized the coded sequence after several repetitions. "That's Princess Isabella," she said with excitement. "She's signaling from inside the building." Alexander looked over Chin's shoulder at the pattern. "What is she telling us?" Chin consulted the protocol manual on her tablet. "She's indicating that she's mobile within the building and that there are approximately 8 to 10 hostile personnel with military-grade weapons. She's also signaling that she believes she can reach the building's loading dock area. Can we coordinate with her? If we can establish a pattern of response signals, yes. But we'll need to be careful not to alert the kidnappers to what we're doing." Alexander made a decision that would have shocked his security advisors and diplomatic protocol specialists. "Tell her we're planning a coordinated entry through multiple access points in 15 minutes. If she can reach the loading dock area, we'll have a team in position to extract her safely." Chin hesitated. "Sir, if something goes wrong and the princess is injured during the rescue attempt, the political consequences could be devastating." Alexander looked at the warehouse where his sister was being held by people who had already demonstrated their willingness to commit treason. "Detective Chun, the political consequences of allowing this to succeed would be far worse than the risks of acting decisively." Inside the building, Isabella saw the responding light signals from the teams outside and felt a surge of hope. Alexander was planning a coordinated rescue, and she would have a role to play in ensuring its success. She began making her way through the ceiling space toward the loading dock area, moving carefully to avoid making noise that might alert the guards below. The building's structure was complex, and she had to navigate around ventilation equipment and electrical conduits while maintaining her sense of direction. As she moved, Isabella could hear increased radio chatter from Hartley's team. They were clearly aware that something was happening outside, and their voices carried the tension of people preparing for a confrontation they might not survive. She reached a position above the loading dock area and could see that it was currently unguarded, with the security personnel focused on the main entrances where they expected the rescue teams to attempt entry. However, she also noticed that there were motion sensors and cameras that would detect anyone entering through the loading dock. Isabella realized that she needed to find a way to disable the security systems in the loading dock area before the rescue team arrived. She located what appeared to be the main control panel for the building's security system and began carefully examining its wiring. Working with the technical knowledge she had gained from her royal education and her own curiosity about how things worked, Isabella managed to identify the circuits controlling the loading dock sensors. She carefully disconnected the appropriate wires, hoping that the security monitors would interpret the loss of signal as a routine technical malfunction rather than sabotage. With the sensors disabled, Isabella positioned herself above the loading dock entrance and waited for the rescue team to arrive. She could hear vehicles moving into position outside, and the radio chatter from Hartley's team was becoming increasingly urgent. Through the ventilation system, she heard Colonel Hartley giving orders to his men. "Remember, Our objective is political, not military. We avoid casualties if possible, but we maintain control of the situation until our demands are met. Isabella realized that the next few minutes would determine not just her own fate, but potentially the future of the monarchy itself. If this rescue attempt failed, the political ramifications could destabilize the government. If it succeeded through violence, it could still create a crisis of confidence in the royal family's ability to maintain security and stability. She heard the distinctive sound of vehicles pulling up to the loading dock area and knew that Alexander's plan was being put into motion. Isabella took a deep breath and prepared to play her part in what would either be a successful rescue operation or the beginning of a much larger crisis for the Kingdom of Valeria. The rescue operation commenced with precision timing that reflected months of training for exactly this type of scenario. Alexander watched from his command vehicle as 3 separate teams approached the warehouse from different angles, each equipped with specialized equipment for dealing with hostage situations involving members of the royal family. Detective Chun coordinated the operation through encrypted communications while monitoring Isabella's continued light signals from inside the building. The princess had managed to disable the loading dock security systems and was positioned to assist with her own rescue, but the situation remained extremely dangerous for everyone involved. Alpha Team in position at main entrance came the first report through Chen's earpiece. Beta Team ready at secondary access point followed immediately. Gamma Team approaching loading dock completed the trilogy of coordinated positions. Alexander studied the thermal imaging display showing heat signatures throughout the building. Isabella's signal had helped them identify the approximate positions of Hartley's men, but there were still unknowns that could turn the rescue attempt into a disaster. All teams, remember that our primary objective is the safe extraction of Princess Isabella, Chen transmitted. Minimum force necessary, maximum precision. Inside the building, Colonel Hartley was facing the reality that his carefully planned operation was about to be tested in ways he had hoped to avoid. The political leverage he had sought to gain by holding Princess Isabella was being challenged by Crown Prince Alexander's willingness to risk a direct confrontation. "Sir, we could use the princess as a negotiating tool to secure safe passage out of the country," suggested one of his lieutenants, a former military intelligence officer named Captain Morrison. Hartley shook his head. "That would make us common criminals rather than patriots acting in defense of the kingdom. We maintain our positions and continue to seek a political resolution." Margaret Thornberry, who had been monitoring news reports on her tablet, looked up with concern. "Colonel, the government has issued a statement describing this as a terrorist action against the royal family. We're losing the narrative battle." "The narrative will change once people understand what's really at stake," Hartley replied, but his voice carried less conviction than it had earlier in the evening. Above them in the ceiling space, Isabella could hear the conversation clearly through the ventilation system. She realized that Hartley's team was beginning to fracture under pressure, which could make them either more or less dangerous, depending on how individual members chose to respond to the stress. She continued moving toward the loading dock area, navigating through the increasingly complex maze of ducts and electrical conduits. The building's construction was older than she had initially realized, with multiple renovations that had created unexpected pathways through the structure. Isabella reached a position directly above the loading dock and could see the rescue team vehicles positioning themselves outside. She carefully removed a ceiling tile and lowered herself partway down to get a better view of the area. The loading dock was a large open space with several roll-up doors and a raised platform for truck deliveries. More importantly, it appeared to be the building's weakest point in terms of defensive positions, which explained why Hartley's team had focused their security on the main entrances. Isabella heard the distinctive sound of tactical equipment being deployed outside and knew that Gamma Team was preparing to breach the loading dock entrance. She positioned herself to drop down from the ceiling when they made their entry, timing her movement to coincide with their arrival. The loading dock door exploded inward with a controlled demolition charge, followed immediately by tactical officers in full protective gear. Isabella dropped from the ceiling as planned, landing behind a stack of shipping containers that provided cover from the rest of the building. "Princess Isabella secure," the team leader reported immediately through his radio, proceeding with extraction. However, the breach at the loading dock had alerted Hartley's entire security team, and Isabella could hear shouted orders echoing through the building as armed men moved to respond to the incursion. "Your Highness, we need to move immediately," the team leader said, helping Isabella to her feet. "The building is going to become very dangerous very quickly." As they moved toward the extraction vehicles, Isabella heard gunfire echoing from the main part of the building. The other rescue teams were engaging with Hartley's men, and the careful plan to avoid violence was dissolving into the kind of armed confrontation everyone had hoped to prevent. "Wait," Isabella said, stopping despite the urgency of the situation. "There are innocent people in this building who were coerced into participating. Marcus Whitfield, my driver, isn't a terrorist. He's a good man who was manipulated into making terrible choices." The team leader looked at her with professional patience that masked his desire to complete the extraction as quickly as possible. "Your Highness, our orders are to get you to safety immediately. I understand that, but I'm giving you a direct order as a member of the royal family," Isabella replied with the kind of authority that allowed no argument. "We don't abandon people who can still be saved." Meanwhile, Alexander was monitoring the extraction through multiple video feeds while coordinating with Detective Chun and the tactical commanders. The rescue operation was succeeding, but the cost in terms of violence and potential casualties was higher than anyone had wanted. "Princess Isabella is secure and moving to extraction vehicles," Chun reported. "However, she's requesting that we attempt to extract her driver and other coerced participants before completing the operation." Alexander felt a mixture of relief at Isabella's safety and admiration for her moral courage. Even in the middle of a rescue operation, she was thinking about the welfare of others, including people who had participated in her kidnapping. "Tell Gamma Team to proceed according to the princess's guidance," Alexander ordered. "She knows these people better than we do." Back in the warehouse, Colonel Hartley was dealing with the collapse of his carefully planned operation. 2 of his men had been wounded in the firefight with the rescue teams, and it was becoming clear that the political leverage he had hoped to gain was evaporating rapidly. Marcus Whitfield approached him with visible distress. "Colonel, this has gone too far. People are getting hurt, and the princess was never supposed to be in real danger." "Marcus, we knew there would be risks when we committed to this course of action," Hartley replied. "Sometimes the cost of preserving what's important is higher than we'd prefer." "But what are we actually preserving?" Marcus asked. "We've kidnapped a member of the royal family, engaged in armed conflict with law enforcement, and turned ourselves into criminals. How does any of this serve the kingdom?" Margaret Thornberry, who had been trying to maintain communications with political supporters outside the building, looked up from her phone with despair. "Colonel, we've lost all political support. Even the restoration movement is distancing itself from our actions." Hartley stared at the tactical map that had seemed so promising just a few hours ago. The carefully planned operation designed to create political pressure for change had instead created a crisis that would likely strengthen support for exactly the policies he had been trying to oppose. "Sir, we still have options," Captain Morrison said. "If we can reach the vehicles in the back parking area, we could attempt to leave the country and continue our political activities from exile." Hartley shook his head slowly. "Captain, we're not criminals fleeing justice. We're patriots who miscalculated the best way to serve our country." The sound of tactical teams approaching their position was getting closer, and Hartley realized that the next few minutes would determine whether his team surrendered peacefully or escalated the confrontation into something even more tragic. Isabella, accompanied by Gamma Team, had re-entered the building through a service corridor that allowed them to approach the main area where Hartley's team was located. She had insisted on participating in the attempt to convince Marcus and others to surrender peacefully, despite the obvious risks involved. "Marcus," she called out as they approached the area where he was positioned with 2 other men. "It's Isabella. I want to talk to you." Marcus appeared from behind a makeshift barrier, his weapon lowered, and his face showing the strain of the past several hours. "Your Highness, I'm so sorry about all of this. I never wanted it to go this far." "I know you didn't, Marcus," Isabella replied, stepping forward despite the tactical officer's obvious concern for her safety. "You're not a criminal, and you're not a terrorist. You're a good man who got caught up in something that spiraled out of control. But what I did was still wrong," Marcus said, his voice breaking with emotion. "I betrayed your trust and put you in danger. How can you even look at me?" Isabella moved closer, ignoring the weapons and the tactical situation surrounding them. "Because I know who you really are, Marcus. I know about your service record, your family, your character. One terrible mistake doesn't erase years of loyalty and dedication." Behind Marcus, the other 2 men were watching the conversation with expressions that suggested they were reconsidering their own positions. Isabella realized that she had an opportunity to end this confrontation without additional violence if she could convince them that surrender was both honorable and practical. All of you have served this kingdom with distinction at various points in your lives, she continued, addressing the group. Colonel Hartley was a decorated officer. Captain Morrison served with honor in 3 overseas deployments. Even the people who recruited you did so because they believed they were acting in the country's best interests. From deeper in the building, Colonel Hartley's voice echoed through the space. Your Highness, you're being generous to people who don't deserve your consideration. Isabella called back toward his position. Colonel Hartley, you're wrong about that. Everyone deserves consideration, especially when they're facing the consequences of choices made under stress and manipulation. She turned back to Marcus and the others. You have families who love you, people who depend on you, futures that don't have to be destroyed by what happened here tonight. But only if you choose to end this peacefully. Marcus lowered his weapon completely and stepped away from the barrier. Your Highness, I want to surrender, but I'm afraid of what will happen to my wife and children if I'm imprisoned for treason. Marcus, the legal system will take into account the circumstances of your actions and your cooperation in resolving this situation, Isabella assured him. But, more importantly, I will personally ensure that your family receives support and that your service to the royal family is remembered as part of your complete record. The 2 men with Marcus looked at each other and then followed his example, lowering their weapons and moving away from their defensive positions. Isabella felt a surge of relief as she realized that at least part of the confrontation was being resolved without additional violence. However, deeper in the building, Colonel Hartley and his core group of supporters were still maintaining their positions. The sound of approaching tactical teams suggested that the main confrontation was still ahead, and Isabella knew that her moral authority might not be sufficient to convince the true believers who had organized the entire operation. Alexander, monitoring the situation from his command vehicle, felt conflicted as he watched his sister successfully defuse part of the crisis while potentially exposing herself to additional danger. Her moral courage was admirable, but it was also placing her in situations that his security training told him were unacceptably risky. Detective Chun, can we complete the extraction of Princess Isabella and the surrendering suspects while continuing operations against the remaining hostiles? He asked. Chun studied the tactical situation display. Sir, the princess appears to be determined to attempt negotiations with Colonel Hartley personally. She believes she can convince him to surrender peacefully. Alexander closed his eyes and tried to balance his protective instincts as a brother with his responsibilities as a future king. Isabella was demonstrating exactly the kind of moral leadership that the monarchy needed, but she was also walking into a situation where ideologically motivated people with military training were facing the end of their cause. Tell her she has 10 minutes to attempt negotiations, Alexander decided. After that, we complete the tactical operation regardless of her preferences. Isabella, having successfully convinced Marcus Whitfield and 2 others to surrender, was now approaching the area where Colonel Hartley had established his final defensive position. She could see that he had approximately 4 men with him, all armed and positioned behind barriers that would make any tactical assault extremely dangerous for everyone involved. Colonel Hartley, she called out, I'd like to speak with you about ending this situation peacefully. Your Highness, Hartley replied from behind his barrier. I appreciate your concern for avoiding additional bloodshed, but some principles are worth fighting for regardless of the personal cost. Isabella moved closer, despite the obvious tension from both the tactical teams behind her and the armed men in front of her. Colonel, what principles are you fighting for right now? What are you actually accomplishing by continuing this confrontation? I'm fighting for the soul of this kingdom, Hartley replied. For the values and traditions that made Valeria strong, and against the foreign influences that will destroy everything our ancestors built. Isabella paused before responding, realizing that she was dealing with someone whose worldview had become so rigid that he was willing to die rather than acknowledge that his methods were wrong, even if his concerns about the kingdom's future were legitimate topics for democratic debate. Colonel Hartley, assume for a moment that your concerns about the kingdom's direction are completely valid, she said. How does holding me hostage and engaging in armed conflict with law enforcement actually address those concerns? It demonstrates that there are still people willing to sacrifice everything to preserve what's important, Hartley replied. Isabella felt a chill as she realized that Colonel Hartley had moved beyond rational political calculation into something approaching martyrdom. He was no longer thinking about achieving practical goals through his actions. He was thinking about making a symbolic statement that would be remembered after his death. This made him far more dangerous than a rational criminal or even a passionate political extremist. Martyrs couldn't be negotiated with because they had already accepted the cost of their principles, regardless of the practical consequences for themselves or others. Isabella glanced back at the tactical team behind her and made a decision that would either save lives or cost her own. Isabella made the decision that would define her legacy as a member of the royal family. Instead of retreating to safety as every security protocol dictated, she walked directly toward Colonel Hartley's position with her hands visible and empty, demonstrating the kind of moral courage that history would remember long after the political details of this night were forgotten. "Colonel Hartley, I'm coming to speak with you directly," she announced, her voice carrying clearly through the warehouse space. "I'm unarmed, and I'm alone." Behind her, she could hear the tactical team leader speaking urgently into his radio, undoubtedly reporting to Alexander that the princess was taking actions that exponentially increased the danger to everyone involved. But Isabella had realized something that military training and security protocols couldn't account for. Sometimes moral authority was the most powerful weapon available. "Your Highness, please maintain your distance," Hartley called out, but his voice carried uncertainty that hadn't been there before. Isabella continued walking forward until she was close enough to see Hartley's face clearly. He was a man in his late 40s with the bearing of someone who had spent decades in military service, but his eyes showed the strain of someone whose worldview was colliding with reality in ways he hadn't anticipated. "Colonel, look at me," Isabella said quietly. "Look at what this situation has become. You began with concerns about the kingdom's future, and you've created a crisis that will be used to justify exactly the kind of security measures and foreign partnerships you oppose." Hartley's weapon was lowered, but still ready, and Isabella could see that he was struggling with the contradiction between his ideological commitments and the practical results of his actions. "Your Highness, the policies your brother supports will fundamentally change the character of Valeria," he said. "The trade agreements will make us dependent on foreign powers. The social reforms will undermine traditional institutions. The immigration policies will alter the demographic composition of the kingdom." Isabella nodded thoughtfully. "Colonel, those are legitimate concerns that deserve serious consideration in any democracy. But kidnapping members of the royal family isn't democratic debate. It's the kind of authoritarian action you claim to oppose. Sometimes extraordinary circumstances require extraordinary responses," Hartley replied, but his voice carried less conviction than it had earlier. "Extraordinary circumstances require extraordinary wisdom, not extraordinary violence," Isabella countered. "You've served this kingdom for over 15 years with distinction. You understand the difference between defending democracy and destroying it." Behind Hartley, Isabella could see that his remaining supporters were listening to the conversation with increasing uncertainty. These were men who had followed him because they believed in his cause, but they were beginning to see that the cause had led them into actions they couldn't justify. Captain Morrison stepped forward slightly. "Colonel, perhaps we should consider the princess's perspective. This operation isn't achieving our political objectives." Hartley turned to look at Morrison with an expression that mixed disappointment with understanding. "Captain, are you questioning our mission?" "Sir, I'm questioning whether continuing this confrontation serves any purpose beyond symbolic gesture," Morrison replied. "We've lost political support, we're facing serious criminal charges, and we're putting innocent people at risk." Isabella seized the opportunity to address Morrison directly. "Captain, your military record shows service in 3 overseas deployments where you protected democratic institutions in other countries. How is what you're doing here tonight different from the authoritarian actions you fought against abroad?" Morrison's face showed the internal struggle of someone confronting an uncomfortable truth about his own actions. "Your Highness, we believed we were protecting democracy from internal threats." "Captain, democracy is protected by supporting democratic institutions and processes, not by bypassing them through violence," Isabella replied. "You can still choose to honor your oath to defend the Constitution by ending this peacefully." Margaret Thornberry, who had been silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke up. "Colonel, we need to face reality. This operation has failed to achieve any of its political objectives, and continuing will only make the situation worse." Hartley looked around at his supporters and could see that his moral authority as a leader was evaporating as his followers began to understand the true implications of their actions. The political movement he had hoped to inspire was instead turning into exactly the kind of criminal conspiracy that would discredit their cause for generations. "Your Highness," Hartley said slowly, "if we surrender, what happens to the concerns we were trying to address?" What happens to the people who believe the kingdom is heading in the wrong direction? Isabella moved even closer, close enough that she was within easy reach of his weapon if he chose to use it. The gesture of trust was not lost on any of the men watching the exchange. Colonel, those concerns get addressed through democratic processes, not through criminal actions, she said. If you believe the government is making mistakes, you organize political opposition, you support candidates who share your views, you write articles, and give speeches, and participate in the democratic process. But what if the democratic process doesn't work? What if foreign influences and special interests have too much power for ordinary citizens to overcome? Hartley asked. Isabella smiled slightly. Then, you keep fighting democratically until you win, or until you're convinced by better arguments. That's what democracy means, Colonel. It means accepting that you might be wrong about some things, and that other people might have insights you haven't considered. And if I'm right about the threats facing the kingdom, then you'll convince people through the power of your arguments rather than the force of your weapons, Isabella replied. Truth doesn't need violence to support it, Colonel. If your concerns are valid, they'll stand up to democratic scrutiny. Hartley was quiet for a long moment, and Isabella could see that he was genuinely wrestling with the implications of what she was saying. This was a man who had convinced himself that his criminal actions were patriotic necessities, and she was asking him to consider that patriotism might require admitting he was wrong. From outside the building, Isabella could hear vehicles arriving and the sounds of additional tactical units taking positions. Alexander was clearly preparing for the possibility that negotiations would fail and that a forced resolution would be necessary. Colonel, you have about 5 minutes to make a decision that will determine how history remembers you and your supporters, Isabella said gently. You can surrender peacefully and face the legal consequences of your actions with dignity, or you can continue this confrontation until it ends in violence that serves no one's interests. Your Highness, if we surrender, we face life imprisonment for treason, Captain Morrison said. If you continue this confrontation, you face death or worse charges, and your families face the shame of knowing you died as criminals rather than patriots, Isabella replied. More importantly, you face the knowledge that your actions will be used to justify exactly the kind of authoritarian security measures you claim to oppose. Isabella could see understanding dawning on the faces of several of Hartley's supporters. They were beginning to realize that their actions had created a political situation that would strengthen the very trends they had been trying to oppose. Margaret Thornberry put down her phone and spoke with quiet resignation. Colonel, I've been in contact with our political supporters throughout this crisis. The restoration movement is not just distancing itself from our actions, it's actively condemning them. We've destroyed the political movement we were trying to serve. Hartley closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, Isabella could see that something fundamental had changed in his expression. The ideological certainty that had driven him to kidnap a member of the royal family was being replaced by the kind of moral clarity that comes from honestly confronting the consequences of one's actions. Your Highness, he said quietly, I need you to understand that our concerns about the kingdom's future were sincere, even if our methods were inexcusable. I do understand that, Colonel, Isabella replied. And I hope you understand that those concerns can still be addressed through legitimate political processes, but only if you choose to end this situation in a way that preserves your moral authority to advocate for your beliefs. Hartley lowered his weapon completely and stepped away from his defensive position. Captain Morrison, MS. Thornberry, gentlemen, we're going to surrender unconditionally to the Royal Protection Units. The relief in the warehouse was palpable as Hartley's remaining supporters followed his example, lowering their weapons and moving away from their barriers. Isabella felt a surge of gratitude mixed with exhaustion as she realized that the crisis was finally ending without additional bloodshed. However, as the tactical teams moved in to secure the surrendering suspects, Isabella heard Alexander's voice coming through a portable radio that one of the officers was carrying. All teams, we have intelligence suggesting that this warehouse operation may have been part of a larger conspiracy involving multiple locations and additional participants, Alexander was saying. Maintain security protocols and prepare for possible secondary operations. Isabella felt a chill as she realized that Colonel Hartley's kidnapping plot might have been just one component of a broader attempt to destabilize the monarchy. If there were other operations in progress, the night's events might be far from over. Detective Chen's voice came through the radio with an urgent update. Control to all units. We have reports of suspicious activity at the Royal Treasury building and unusual communications traffic suggesting coordinated action by restoration movement cells in multiple cities. Isabella looked at Colonel Hartley, who appeared genuinely surprised by this intelligence. Colonel, did you coordinate your actions with other groups? Hartley shook his head. Your Highness, our operation was independent. We specifically avoided coordination with other elements to maintain operational security. Margaret Thornberry looked at her phone with alarm. Colonel, I'm receiving messages from Restoration Movement contacts suggesting that our action was supposed to be a signal for broader operations. They're asking about timing for additional actions. Isabella realized that Hartley's team had been manipulated into serving as the catalyst for a much larger conspiracy that they hadn't fully understood. Their kidnapping operation wasn't an isolated incident. It was designed to be the first move in a coordinated attempt to create a crisis of confidence in the monarchy. Who gave you the intelligence about timing and coordination? Isabella asked Thornberry. Lord Chancellor Blackwood provided most of our operational guidance, Thornberry replied, her face showing growing alarm as she began to understand the implications. Isabella felt everything click into place. Lord Chancellor Blackwood hadn't just been a political supporter of Hartley's cause. He had been the operational coordinator of a conspiracy that extended far beyond the warehouse where she had been held. Hartley and his team had been pawns in a much larger game. She turned to the tactical team leader who was coordinating communications with Alexander. You need to tell my brother immediately that Lord Chancellor Blackwood is the primary conspirator and that tonight's events were designed to trigger additional operations that may already be in progress. As the tactical teams completed the arrest of Hartley's group and prepared to transport them to secure detention facilities, Isabella realized that her rescue was just the beginning of what would likely be the most serious threat to the monarchy in the kingdom's modern history. The question was whether Alexander would be able to identify and stop the other components of Blackwood's conspiracy before they could achieve whatever political objectives had motivated this entire elaborate operation. Isabella was safe, but the Kingdom of Valeria was still in danger, and the next few hours would determine whether the monarchy survived its greatest internal crisis since the constitutional reforms of the previous century. As she was escorted to the armored vehicles that would take her back to the palace, Isabella could see the lights of the capital city in the distance and wondered what other conspirators might be moving into position while everyone's attention had been focused on her rescue. The royal intervention had succeeded in saving her life, but it might have been exactly what Lord Chancellor Blackwood had been counting on to achieve his larger goals. The drive back to Valeria Palace was unlike any journey Isabella had ever experienced. The armored convoy moved through the capital city at high speed, while Alexander coordinated multiple security operations from the lead vehicle, and Isabella found herself in the surreal position of being both a rescued hostage and a key intelligence asset in an ongoing national security crisis. Detective Chun was in constant communication with intelligence services throughout the kingdom as reports came in of suspicious activities in 3 major cities. The scope of Lord Chancellor Blackwood's conspiracy was becoming apparent, and it was far more extensive than anyone had initially realized. Princess Isabella, Chun said, turning from her communications equipment, we need you to help us understand exactly what Lord Chancellor Blackwood said to you during your captivity. Any details about timing, coordination, or other participants could be critical to stopping whatever else he has planned. Isabella closed her eyes and tried to recall every detail of her conversations with Blackwood in the warehouse. He mentioned that this was about preserving traditional values and preventing foreign influence, but he also said something about necessary changes in leadership that made me think they weren't just trying to influence policy. Alexander's voice came through the vehicle's intercom from the lead car. Isabella, I need to ask you about something that might be difficult. Did Blackwood say anything that suggested they were targeting me specifically, or were they focused on broader changes in government? Isabella considered the question carefully. Alexander, I think they were using me as leverage to force you into a position where you would have to choose between protecting me and maintaining your political positions. But there was something in the way he talked about changes in leadership that suggested they might have been planning to use the crisis to justify more dramatic action. Detective Chun was monitoring multiple communication channels simultaneously, and her expression was growing increasingly concerned. Your Highness, we're receiving reports that parliamentary leaders are being contacted by Restoration Movement representatives claiming that tonight's events demonstrate the need for immediate constitutional reforms. Alexander's response was immediate and decisive. All parliamentary leaders are to be provided with immediate security details, and any attempts at unauthorized constitutional discussions are to be reported to royal intelligence immediately. As the convoy reached the outskirts of the palace grounds, Isabella could see that the entire complex had been transformed into what appeared to be a military command center. Additional security vehicles surrounded the palace, and she could see personnel with military equipment positioned at strategic locations throughout the grounds. "Isabella," Alexander said through the intercom, "I need you to be prepared for the possibility that we're going to be coordinating multiple operations throughout the night. Your insights into Blackwood's psychology and his statements during your captivity may be critical to understanding what he's really trying to accomplish." The convoy pulled into the palace's secure courtyard, where Isabella was immediately met by medical personnel who insisted on examining her despite her protests that she was uninjured. The medical examination was routine, but it provided an opportunity for Alexander to brief her on the broader situation while the doctors completed their assessment. "Isabella, we've identified at least 3 additional operations that appear to be coordinated with your kidnapping," Alexander explained. "There's been an attempt to infiltrate the Royal Treasury building, suspicious communications traffic suggesting planned demonstrations in Parliament Square, and intelligence indicating that some military units may have been contacted about providing security during a constitutional crisis." Isabella felt a chill as she began to understand the true scope of what Blackwood had been planning. "Alexander, this wasn't just about kidnapping me to create political pressure. This was about creating a crisis that would justify military intervention in the government." "That's our assessment as well," Alexander replied. "Blackwood appears to have been planning a soft coup disguised as a response to a security emergency." The medical examination concluded with a clean bill of health, and Isabella was escorted to Alexander's private study where a crisis management team had been established. The room was filled with monitors displaying information from around the kingdom, and personnel from multiple intelligence and security agencies were coordinating responses to what was clearly a coordinated attack on the constitutional system. General Patricia Hawthorne, the Chief of Defense Staff, looked up from a tactical map as Isabella entered. "Your Highness, we need to understand whether Lord Chancellor Blackwood mentioned any specific military units or personnel during your conversations with him." Isabella thought carefully. He didn't mention specific units, but he did talk about people in the military who shared his concerns about the kingdom's direction. He seemed confident that there would be support for his actions from within the armed forces. General Hawthorne exchanged glances with Alexander. "Sir, we've identified 2 colonels and a brigadier who have been in regular contact with Restoration Movement leadership. They're currently being questioned about their knowledge of tonight's events." Isabella realized that she was witnessing the unraveling of a conspiracy that could have toppled the government if it had been allowed to proceed according to Blackwood's plan. The kidnapping operation had been designed not just to create political pressure, but to justify the kind of emergency measures that would allow conspiratorial elements within the government and military to seize control. "Where is Lord Chancellor Blackwood now?" Isabella asked. Detective Chen looked up from her communications equipment. "Your Highness, that's one of our primary concerns. Lord Chancellor Blackwood has not been seen since leaving the charity gala earlier this evening, and he's not responding to any attempts at contact. We believe he may be at a secondary command center coordinating the other elements of the conspiracy." Alexander studied the tactical displays showing security operations throughout the kingdom. "Our priority is to locate Blackwood and determine what other operations he may have set in motion. Isabella, I need you to think about anything he said that might give us insight into where he would go or what his contingency plans might be." Isabella closed her eyes and tried to recall every detail of her interactions with Blackwood, not just during her captivity, but throughout the months preceding the crisis. "Alexander, remember that Blackwood has access to secure government facilities that most people don't know about. He also has relationships with foreign intelligence services dating back to his early diplomatic career. Are you suggesting he might attempt to flee the country?" General Hawthorne asked. "I'm suggesting he might have resources and safe houses that aren't documented in our intelligence files," Isabella replied. "He's been planning this for months at minimum, and someone with his experience would have prepared multiple contingencies." As if summoned by her words, Detective Chen's radio crackled with an urgent transmission. "Control to all units. We have visual confirmation of Lord Chancellor Blackwood at a private airfield approximately 30 miles northeast of the capital. He appears to be preparing to board an aircraft." Alexander was on his feet immediately. "All units converge on that location." I want him taken into custody before he can leave the country. Isabella stood up as well. Alexander, I want to be part of the operation to apprehend Blackwood. Absolutely not, Alexander replied without hesitation. You've been through enough tonight, and there's no justification for exposing you to additional risk. There's every justification, Isabella countered. Blackwood used me as a pawn in his conspiracy, and I may be the person best positioned to understand his psychology and motivations. If you want to end this crisis definitively, you need my insights into how his mind works. General Hawthorne looked between the two siblings and made a practical assessment. Your Highness, Princess Isabella's analysis has been accurate throughout this crisis. Her presence during Blackwood's apprehension might provide valuable intelligence about other aspects of the conspiracy. Alexander clearly didn't like the idea, but he was also beginning to understand that Isabella's moral authority and analytical insights had been crucial to resolving the warehouse situation peacefully. If you participate, you remain in the command vehicle at all times, and you follow security protocols without argument. Agreed, Isabella said immediately. The convoy that left Valeria Palace 20 minutes later was larger and more heavily equipped than the rescue operation had been. Intelligence services had confirmed that the airfield was being used by Blackwood and an unknown number of associates, and there was evidence suggesting that he might have been preparing to coordinate additional operations from outside the country. As they approached the airfield, Isabella could see a small aircraft on the runway with its engines running. Several vehicles were positioned near the aircraft, and thermal imaging suggested approximately 6 to 8 people in the immediate area. This is it, Alexander said, reviewing the tactical plan with his security team. We need to apprehend Blackwood and any associates while preventing them from destroying evidence that might help us identify other conspirators. The operation commenced with the same precision as the warehouse rescue, but with the additional complexity of preventing aircraft from departing while maintaining the safety of everyone involved. Isabella watched from the command vehicle as tactical teams surrounded the airfield and began coordinating the apprehension of the conspirators. Through the vehicle's communication system, she could hear radio traffic as the operation unfolded. Target 1 identified as Lord Chancellor Blackwood, attempting to board aircraft, came the first report. All targets ordered to surrender, compliance appears negative, followed immediately. Isabella leaned forward to study the video feeds from the tactical teams. She could see Blackwood clearly for the first time since the charity gala, and his expression showed the kind of desperate determination that suggested he was prepared to resist arrest regardless of the consequences. Alexander, she said, I think Blackwood is planning to make this a public spectacle. He wants to be seen as a martyr for his cause rather than as a criminal fleeing justice. What do you mean? Alexander asked. Look at his positioning and the way his associates are deployed, Isabella replied, pointing to the tactical display. They're not trying to escape efficiently. They're creating a situation that will maximize media attention and public sympathy for their cause. As if to confirm Isabella's analysis, Detective Chen's radio came alive with reports from around the kingdom. Control to all units. We're receiving reports of demonstrations beginning in Parliament Square and other major cities. Restoration Movement supporters appear to be claiming that Lord Chancellor Blackwood is being persecuted for his political beliefs. Isabella felt the final pieces of Blackwood's strategy falling into place. Alexander, the airfield operation isn't an escape attempt. It's a carefully staged political theater designed to create the impression that the monarchy is using authoritarian tactics against legitimate political opposition. You're saying this entire evening has been designed to make us look like the aggressors? Alexander asked. I'm saying that Blackwood has been manipulating events from the beginning to create a narrative that serves his political objectives regardless of whether his immediate operations succeed or fail, Isabella replied. Alexander stared at the tactical displays and realized that they were facing an opponent who had thought several moves ahead of everyone else. General Hawthorne, modify the operation to ensure that Blackwood's apprehension appears as professional and restrained as possible. We cannot allow him to control the narrative about tonight's events. The tactical teams adjusted their approach to emphasize de-escalation and professional law enforcement procedures rather than military-style operations. Isabella watched as officers approached Blackwood's position with their weapons lowered and their hands visible, calling for peaceful surrender through loudspeakers. Lord Chancellor Blackwood, you are ordered to surrender yourself for questioning in connection with tonight's kidnapping and conspiracy charges, the team leader announced. You will not be harmed if you comply with lawful orders. Isabella could see Blackwood conferring with his associates before walking slowly toward the tactical teams with his hands raised. As he was taken into custody, she noticed that he was speaking constantly, undoubtedly ensuring that his words would be recorded and could be used later to support whatever political narrative he intended to promote. "Your Highness," Detective Chin reported, "we have Lord Chancellor Blackwood and 4 associates in custody. We've also secured documents and electronic devices that should provide intelligence about the broader conspiracy." Alexander nodded with satisfaction, but Isabella could see that he understood, as she did, that apprehending Blackwood was only the beginning of dealing with the political crisis he had created. As the convoy returned to Valeria Palace with their prisoners, Isabella reflected on the events of the night and their likely consequences. She had been kidnapped, rescued, and had played a crucial role in preventing what could have been a successful coup attempt disguised as a political crisis. More importantly, she had learned something about herself and about the kind of leadership the monarchy would need in the years ahead. The challenges facing the kingdom were real and complex, requiring the kind of moral courage and political wisdom that couldn't be taught in protocol classes or military academies. As dawn broke over the capital city, Isabella realized that the royal intervention that had saved her life had also revealed the strength and character of the constitutional system that her family was sworn to defend. The kingdom had faced its greatest internal threat in generations and had responded with both decisive action and moral clarity. Lord Chancellor Blackwood's conspiracy had failed not because it was poorly planned or executed, but because it had underestimated the fundamental resilience of democratic institutions and the people who served them with genuine dedication. The Kingdom of Valeria would face other challenges in the years ahead, but Isabella was confident that they would meet those challenges with the same combination of courage, wisdom, and moral authority that had carried them through the longest night in the monarchy's recent history. The sun was rising on a kingdom that had been tested and had not been found wanting.